My name is Jack Turner, and I've lived on the same piece of land outside Rich County for almost 20 years. When I first bought the property, it was nothing but open pasture, a few oak trees, and an old dirt road that cut through the middle of the valley. It was quiet, peaceful, and exactly the kind of place I wanted to build a ranch. Back then there weren't many neighbors. Just a few farms scattered across the hills and a small creek running along the northern boundary of my land. For years the place stayed that way. I built a barn, added fencing, and slowly turned the land into a working ranch. Then the developers arrived. About 8 years ago, a construction company bought a large section of land next to my property and announced plans for a residential community called Pine Ridge Estates. Within a year, bulldozers started clearing trees, paving roads, and building houses faster than anyone expected. By the time the construction finished, Pine Ridge Estates had become a full neighborhood with hundreds of homes, sidewalks, parks, and of course a homeowners association. The HOA president was a woman named Karen Whitfield. If you lived in Pine Ridge Estates, you knew Karen. She enforced every rule in the HOA handbook like it was a legal statute. Lawn height, trash can placement, mailbox design, nothing escaped her attention. At first, she ignored my ranch. After all, my property wasn't part of Pine Ridge Estates. It sat just outside their boundary fence. I figured the HOA would leave me alone since I wasn't one of their residents. For a while, that's exactly what happened. Then one afternoon, a letter showed up in my mailbox. It had the Pine Ridge Estates HOA logo printed across the top and a list of violations written underneath. According to the letter, my property had several issues that didn't comply with HOA community standards. My barn roof was visually disruptive, my cattle fence didn't match neighborhood aesthetics, and the gravel driveway near my gate created dust concerns for nearby residents. At first I thought the letter had been delivered by mistake. I wasn't part of their neighborhood. But a week later another letter arrived. This one included something new, a fine, $5,000. I actually laughed when I read it. There was no way an HOA could fine someone who wasn't even a member, so I ignored it. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This time, the total fines had increased to $20,000. Apparently, new violations had been added. My tractors were visible from the road. The hay bales near my barn were considered unsightly. Even the water trough for my cattle had been listed as a violation. By the end of the month, the fines had reached nearly $50,000. That's when I decided to drive over to the Pine Ridge Clubhouse, where the HOA board held their meetings. Karen was standing near the front desk when I walked in. "I assume you're here about the violations," she said immediately. "Yes," I replied. I placed the stack of letters on the table. "You do realize I don't live in your neighborhood," I said. Karen smiled politely. "Your property borders Pine Ridge Estates," she said. "Community standards still apply to surrounding land that affects property values." I stared at her for a moment. "That's not how HOAs work," I said. Karen disagreed. According to her interpretation, the HOA had the authority to enforce standards in the surrounding area if the land impacted their community. Over the next few weeks, the letters kept coming. The fines climbed higher and higher. $100,000, $200,000. Eventually, the total reached $350,000. That was when Karen sent the final notice. If the fines weren't paid, the HOA would pursue legal action. So I did something very simple. I called a property attorney. We spent several hours reviewing the land records for the area, including the original development documents for Pine Ridge Estates. That's when we found something interesting. When the developers built Pine Ridge Estates, they had purchased most of the land required for the neighborhood, but not all of it. There was a long strip of land running beneath the main road that connected the neighborhood to the county highway. That strip had never been sold to the developer. Instead, it had been leased from the previous owner, and according to the records, that previous owner had been my grandfather. When my grandfather passed away several years earlier, the remaining property rights had transferred to me, which meant something very important. The main access road used by every resident of Pine Ridge Estates sat on land that belonged to me. The HOA meeting scheduled to discuss the fines turned into something very different. Karen arrived with several board members and a lawyer. She expected the meeting to focus on collecting the $350,000 in violations. Instead, my attorney placed a copy of the county land survey on the table. It clearly showed the property boundaries. The entire entrance road to Pine Ridge Estates crossed a narrow section of land that I owned. The room went silent. Karen's lawyer studied the map for several minutes before speaking. "Is this accurate?" he asked. My attorney nodded. "County records confirm it." Then he explained the legal reality. Without access to that road, Pine Ridge Estates had no connection to the public highway. Every homeowner used that strip of land daily without realizing it. Karen suddenly looked very nervous, because the situation had completely reversed. The HOA that had been sending me fines for months was now depending on my property for their entire neighborhood's access. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I simply made a proposal. The HOA would immediately cancel all fines issued against my property. They would formally acknowledge that my ranch was not subject to their regulations, and they would sign a permanent access agreement for the entrance road. In return, I would allow the road to remain exactly where it was. The board members agreed almost instantly. Karen didn't say much during the rest of the meeting. Within a week the fines were officially withdrawn. $350,000 in HOA violations disappeared overnight. These days, Pine Ridge Estates still runs its HOA meetings and enforces its neighborhood rules. But my ranch is never mentioned, and every time I drive past the entrance road connecting their neighborhood to the highway, I remember something important. The HOA thought they had the power to fine me for living on my own land. They just forgot to check who owned the ground beneath their entire neighborhood.